The history of Maya civilization is divided into three principal periods: the pre-classic, classic and post-classic periods. These were preceded by the Archaic period, which saw the first settled villages and early developments in agriculture. Modern scholars regard these periods as arbitrary divisions of chronology of the Maya civilization, rather than indicative of cultural evolution or decadence. Definitions of the start and end dates of period spans can vary by as much as a century, depending on the author. The pre-classic lasted from approximately 2000 BC to approximately 250 AD. This was followed by the classic, from 250 AD to roughly 950 AD. Then by the post-classic, from 950 AD to the middle of the 16th century. Each period is further subdivided. Pre-classic period. The Maya developed their first civilization in the pre-classic period. Scholars continue to discuss when this era of Maya civilization began. Discoveries of Maya occupation at Cuelo, Belize have been carbon dated to around 2600 BC. Settlements were established around 1800 BC in the Soconusco region of the Pacific coast, and they were already cultivating the staple crops of the Maya diet, including maize, beans, squash, and chili pepper. This period, known as the early pre-classic, was characterized by sedentary communities and the introduction of pottery and fired clay figurines. During the middle pre-classic period, small villages began to grow to form cities. By 500 BC, these cities possessed large temple structures decorated with stucco masks representing gods. Naquebe in the Petén department of Guatemala is the earliest well-documented city in the Maya lowlands, where large structures have been dated to around 750 BC. Naquebe already featured the monumental masonry architecture, sculpted monuments and causeways that characterized later cities in the Maya lowlands. The northern lowlands of Yucatan were widely settled by the middle pre-classic. By approximately 400 BC, near the end of the middle pre-classic period, early Maya rulers were raising stelae that celebrated their achievements and validated their right to rule. Murals excavated in 2005 have pushed back the origin of Maya writing by several centuries, with a developed script already being used at San Bartolo in Petén by the 3rd century BC, and it is now evident that the Maya participated in the wider development of Mesoamerican writing in the pre-classic. In the late pre-classic period, the enormous city of El Mirador grew to cover approximately 16 square kilometers. It possessed paved avenues, massive triadic pyramid complexes dated to around 150 BC, and stelae and altars that were erected in its plazas. El Mirador is considered to be one of the first capital cities of the Maya civilization. The swamps of the Mirador Basin appear to have been the primary attraction for the first inhabitants of the area, as evidenced by the unusual cluster of large cities around them. The city of Tikal, later to be one of the most important of the classic period Maya cities, was already a significant city by around 350 BC, although it did not match El Mirador. The late pre-classic cultural florescence collapsed in the 1st century AD, and many of the great Maya cities of the epoch were abandoned. The cause of this collapse is as yet unknown. In the highlands, Caminaljuyu emerged as a principal center in the late pre-classic, linking the Pacific coastal trade routes with the Motagua River route, as well as demonstrating increased contact with other sites along the Pacific coast. Caminaljuyu was situated at a crossroads and controlled the trade routes westwards to the Gulf Coast, north into the highlands, and along the Pacific coastal plain to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and El Salvador. This gave it control over the distribution networks for important goods such as jade, obsidian and cinnabar. Within this extended trade route, Tikal, Abaj and Caminaljuyu appear to have been the two principal foci. The early Maya style of sculpture spread throughout this network. Tikal, Abaj and Chocola were two of the most important cities on the Pacific coastal plain during the late pre-classic. and Camchen grew to become an important site in northern Yucatan during the pre-Classic period. The Classic period is largely defined as the period during which the lowland Maya raised dated monuments using the long count calendar. This period marks the peak of large-scale construction and urbanism, the recording of monumental inscriptions, and demonstrated significant intellectual and artistic development, particularly in the southern lowland regions. The Classic period Maya political landscape has been likened to that of Renaissance Italy or Classical Greece, with multiple city-states engaged in a complex network of alliances and enmities. During the Classic period, the Maya civilization achieved its greatest florescence. The Maya developed an agriculturally intensive, city-centered civilization consisting of numerous independent city-states, some subservient to others. During the early Classic, cities throughout the Maya region were influenced by the great metropolis of Teotihuacan in the distant Valley of Mexico. In AD 378, Teotihuacan decisively intervened at Tikal and other nearby cities, deposed its ruler and installed a new Teotihuacan-backed dynasty. This intervention was led by Sage Kak, who arrived at Tikal on 8/17.1.4.12. The king of Tikal, Chaktok-Ichirikai, died on the same day, suggesting a violent takeover. A year later, Sage Kak oversaw the installation of a new king, Jax Nunayinai. The new king's father was spear thrower Owl, who possessed a central Mexican name and may have been the king of either Teotihuacan or Camanaljuyu. The installation of the new dynasty led to a period of political dominance when Tikal became the most powerful city in the central lowlands. At its height during the late Classic, the Tikal city polity had expanded to have a population of well over 100,000. Tikal's great rival was Calakmul, another powerful city polity in the Petén Basin. Tikal and Calakmul both developed extensive systems of allies and vassals. Lesser cities that entered one of these networks gained prestige from their association with the top-tier city, and maintained peaceful relations with other members of the same network. Tikal and Calakmul engaged in the maneuvering of their alliance networks against each other, at various points during the Classic period. One or other of these powers would gain a strategic victory over its great rival, resulting in respective periods of florescence and decline. In 629, Bialaj Chankawil, a son of the Tikal king Kanichmuanjol II, was sent to found a new city 120 kilometers to the west, at Dos Palas, in the Petixpatine region, apparently as an outpost to extend Tikal's power beyond the reach of Calakmul. The young prince was just 4 years old at the time. With the establishment of the new kingdom, Dos Palas advertised its origin by adopting the emblem glyph of Tikal as its own. For the next 2 decades he fought loyally for his brother and overlord at Tikal. In AD 648, King Yanumchin II of Calakmul attacked and defeated Dos Palas, capturing Bialaj Chankawil. At about the same time, the king of Tikal was killed. Yanumchen II then reinstated Bialaj Chankawil upon the throne of Dos Palas as his vassal. In an extraordinary act of treachery for someone claiming to be of the Tikal royal family, he thereafter served as a loyal ally of Calakmul, Tikal's sworn enemy. In the southeast, Copan was the most important city. Its Classic period dynasty was founded in 426 by Kanichiax Mo. The new king had strong ties with central Petén and Teotihuacan, and it is likely that he was originally from Tikal. Copan reached the height of its cultural and artistic development during the rule of Uahaklajuanubaah Kawil, who reigned from 695 to 738. His reign ended catastrophically in April 738, when he was captured by his vassal, King Kak Tilichan, part of Quirigua. The captured Lord of Copan was taken back to Quirigua and, in early May 738, he was decapitated in a public ritual. It is likely that this coup was backed by Calakmul, in order to weaken a powerful ally of Tikal. Palenque and Yaxcalan were the most powerful cities in the Usumacinta region. In the highlands, Caminaljuyu in the valley of Guatemala was already a sprawling city by AD 300. In the north of the Maya area, Coba was the most important capital. Capital cities of Maya kingdoms could vary considerably in size, apparently related to how many vassal cities were tied to the capital. Overlords of city-states that held sway over a greater number of subordinate lords could command greater quantities of tribute in the form of goods and labor. The most notable forms of tribute pictured on Maya ceramics are cacao, textiles and feathers. The social basis of the classic Maya civilization was an extended political and economic network that reached throughout the Maya area and beyond, into the greater Mesoamerican region. The dominant classic period polities were located in the central lowlands. During this period, the southern highlands and northern lowlands can be considered culturally, economically, and politically peripheral to this core area. Those loci that existed between the core and the periphery acted as centers of trade and commerce. The most notable monuments are the pyramid temples and palaces they built in the centers of their greatest cities. At this time, the use of hieroglyphic script on monuments became widespread, and left a large body of information including dated dynastic records, alliances, and other interactions between Maya polities. The sculpting of stone stelae spread throughout the Maya area during the Classic period, and pairings of sculpted stelae and low circular altars are considered a hallmark of classic Maya civilization. During the Classic period, almost every Maya kingdom in the southern lowlands raised stelae in its ceremonial center. The epigrapher David Stewart first proposed that the Maya regarded their stelae as taitun, stone trees, although he later revised his reading to lakamtuns, meaning banner stone. According to Stewart, this may refer to stelae as stone versions of vertical standards that once stood in prominent places in Maya city centers, as depicted in ancient Maya graffiti. The core purpose of a stela was to glorify the king. The Maya civilization participated in long-distance trade, and important trade routes ran from the Motagua River to the Caribbean Sea, then north up the coast to Yucatan. Another route ran from Verapaz along the Pasión River to the trading port at Cancún. From there, trade routes ran east to Belize, northwards to central and northern Petén, and onwards to the Gulf of Mexico and the west coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. Important elite status trade goods included jade, fine ceramics, and quetzal feathers. More basic trade goods may have included obsidian, salt and cacao. Classic Maya collapsed during the 9th century AD. The central Maya region suffered major political collapse, marked by the abandonment of cities, the ending of dynasties, and a northward shift in activity. This decline was coupled with a cessation of monumental inscriptions and large-scale architectural construction. No universally accepted theory explains this collapse, but it is likely to have resulted from a combination of causes, including endemic internecine warfare, overpopulation resulting in severe environmental degradation, and drought. During this period, known as the Terminal Classic, the northern cities of Chichen Itza and Uxmal show increased activity. Major cities in the northern Yucatan Peninsula continued to be inhabited long after the cities of the southern lowlands ceased to raise monuments. There is evidence that the Maya population exceeded the carrying capacity of the environment, resulting in depleted agricultural resources, deforestation, and overhunting of megafauna. A 200-year-long drought appears to have occurred around the same time. Classic Maya social organization was based upon the ritual authority of the ruler, rather than central control of trade and food distribution. This model of rulership was poorly structured to respond to changes, with the ruler's freedom of action being limited to traditional responses. The rulers reacted in their culturally bound manner, by intensifying such activities as construction, ritual, and warfare. This was counterproductive and only served to exacerbate systemic problems. By the 9th and 10th centuries, this resulted in collapse of the system of rulership based around the divine power of the ruling lord. In the northern Yucatan, individual rule was replaced by a ruling council formed from elite lineages. In the southern Yucatan and central Petén, kingdoms generally declined. In western Petén and some other areas, the changes were catastrophic and resulted in the rapid depopulation of cities. Within a couple of generations, large swathes of the central Maya area were all but abandoned. Relatively rapid collapse affected portions of the southern Maya area that included the southern Yucatan Peninsula, northern Chiapas and Guatemala, and the area around Copan in Honduras. The largest cities had populations numbering 50,000 to 120,000 and were linked to networks of subsidiary sites. Both the capitals and their secondary centers were generally abandoned within a period of 50 to 100 years. By the late 8th century, endemic warfare had engulfed the Pitaxpatine region of Petén, resulting in the abandonment of Dos Polas and Aguateca. One by one, many once great cities stopped sculpting dated monuments and were abandoned. The last monuments at Palenque, Piedras Negras and Yaxcalan were dated to between 795 and 810. Over the following decades, Calakmul, Naranjo, Copan, Caracol and Tikal all fell into obscurity. The last long count date was inscribed at Tonina in 909. Stelae were no longer raised, and squatters moved into abandoned royal palaces. Mesoamerican trade routes shifted and bypassed Petén. Post-Classic period. The great cities that dominated Petén had fallen into ruin by the beginning of the 10th century AD with the onset of the Classic Maya collapse. Although much reduced, a significant Maya presence remained into the post-Classic period after the abandonment of the major Classic period cities. The population was particularly concentrated near permanent water sources. Unlike during previous cycles of contraction in the Maya region, abandoned lands were not quickly resettled in the post-Classic. Activity shifted to the northern lowlands and the Maya highlands. This may have involved migration from the southern lowlands, since many post-Classic Maya groups had migration myths. Chichen Itza rose to prominence in the north in the 8th century AD, coincident with the abandonments occurring in the south, which underlines the economic and political factors involved in the collapse. Chichen Itza became what was probably the largest, most powerful and most cosmopolitan of all Maya cities. Chichen Itza and its PUUC neighbors declined dramatically in the 11th century, and this may represent the final episode of the Classic period collapse. After the decline of Chichen Itza, the Maya region lacked a dominant power until the rise of the city of Mayapan in the 12th century. New cities arose near the Caribbean and Gulf coasts, and new trade networks were formed. The post-Classic period was marked by a series of changes that distinguished its cities from those of the preceding Classic period. The once great city of Camonaljuyu in the Valley of Guatemala was abandoned after a period of continuous occupation that spanned almost 2,000 years. This was symptomatic of changes that were sweeping across the highlands and neighboring Pacific coast, with long-occupied cities in exposed locations relocated, apparently due to a proliferation of warfare. Cities came to occupy more easily defended hilltop locations surrounded by deep ravines, with ditch and wall defenses sometimes supplementing the protection provided by the natural terrain. Wall defenses have been identified at a number of sites in the north, including Chaco, Chichen Itza, Cuca, Ekbalam, Mayapan, Muna, Tulum, Uxmal, and Yaxuna. One of the most important cities in the Guatemalan highlands at this time was Cuauhtémoc, also known as Yucatán, the capital of the aggressive Quiche Maya kingdom. The government of Maya states, from the Yucatan to the Guatemalan highlands, was often organized as joint rule by a council. However, in practice one member of the council could act as a supreme ruler, with the other members serving him as advisors. Mayapan was abandoned around 1448, after a period of political, social and environmental turbulence that in many ways echoes the Classic period collapse in the southern Maya region. The abandonment of the city was followed by a period of prolonged warfare in the Yucatan Peninsula, which only ended shortly before Spanish contact in 1511. Even without a dominant regional capital, the early Spanish explorers reported wealthy coastal cities and thriving marketplaces. During the late post-Classic, the Yucatan Peninsula was divided into a number of independent provinces that shared a common culture but varied in their internal socio-political organization. Two of the most important provinces were Mani and Sotuta, which were mutually hostile. At the time of Spanish contact, polities in the northern Yucatan Peninsula included Mani, Sipech, Chucan, Arcangel, Cupul, Chicanchel, Ecap, Uamal, Chetumal, Coquar, Tazas, Hocuba, Sotuta, Chanputun, and Acalan. A number of polities and groups inhabited the southern portion of the peninsula, incorporating the Petén Basin, Belize, and surrounding areas, including the Oaxaca, the Itza, the Kauai, the Yalan, the Chinamita, and the Isesh, the Manchachol, and the Mopan. The Colon Maya-speaking Lacandan controlled territory along the tributaries of the Usumacinta River spanning eastern Chiapas and southwestern Petén. On the eve of the Spanish conquest, the highlands of Guatemala were dominated by several powerful Maya states. In the centuries preceding the arrival of the Spanish, the Quiche had carved out a small empire covering a large part of the western Guatemalan highlands and the neighboring Pacific coastal plain. However, in the late 15th century the Kaqchikal rebelled against their former Quiche allies and founded a new kingdom to the southeast, with Iximcha as its capital. In the decades before the Spanish invasion, the Kaqchikal kingdom had been steadily eroding the kingdom of the Quiche. Other highland groups included the Tutuhi around Lake Atitlan, the Mam in the western highlands and the Poomam in the eastern highlands. The central highlands of Chiapas were occupied by a number of Maya peoples, including the Zazel, who were divided into a number of provinces, and the Tojolabal,